Awesome. Well, I'm taking a look at the attendees and it seems to have stabilized. So I think we're good to get started. Hello to anybody who's just joined. As I mentioned before, in today's webinar, we're going to be providing a overview of our Bee City Communities Handbook as a new resource that we've got available. You can download this on our website. And what we're doing with this is providing an action framework for Bee City communities to protect and promote pollinators. And we also have lots of actions in there of things that communities are currently doing to provide a little recognition and some inspiration. As a final reminder, if anyone would like to tune in French, please click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen, the little globe, and then you can select French from there.
Donc encore une fois, un petit rappel, si vous souhaitez écouter ce webinaire en français, il suffit de cliquer sur l'icône d'interprétation en bas de votre écran, le petit globe, et sélectionner le français.
So before we dive in, I would like to begin by acknowledging the land that Pollinator Partnership Canada resides on. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on as the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I do know we're participating today from all across Canada, as I'm seeing in the comments, so I'd like to invite you to reflect on the land that you are on. Typically with Bee City Canada webinars, we have speakers from outside of the organization that we introduce. But since today we're discussing a resource that we've developed, it's going to be myself and Adèle presenting. So we'll take a minute to introduce ourselves. Probably some of you we've had conversations with, but wanted to introduce ourselves for anyone who we haven't talked to. So my name is Jordan Phelps. I'm the Bee City Program Coordinator for Pollinator Partnership Canada. My passion for pollinators was sparked as an undergraduate at Western University, where I studied animal cognition and learned about the incredible feats of learning and memory that bees and other small-brained but mentally mighty pollinators are capable of. I went on to complete a master's at Western in neuroscience, where I studied how exposure to common pesticides impacts the ability of bumblebees to learn about and gather food from flowers. This experience launched a lifelong interest in pollinators, not only for the good of our food crops and the ecosystem, but also because they're fascinating creatures to watch and learn from. And I'll turn it over to Adèle to introduce herself.
Yeah, hello again, everyone. So my name is Adèle Grenouilleau. I'm a project coordinator for Pollinator Partnership Canada and Bee City Canada. I've been interested in pollinators since an early age due to the fact that I was really curious about nature. And I did a master's degree in political science at the Université du Québec à Montréal, and I specialize in wildlife conservation. And in my final research paper, I explored how wildlife species are put on the international political agenda with a focus on bees. And as a francophone, I am responsible for many things, but also translating documents for P2C, so Pollinator Partnership Canada, and Bee City Canada, including the handbook we will be discussing today.
Awesome. All right, so that is us. I expect at the end we'll have some time for questions. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A. And then at the end, we'll get to as many as we can. So with that, I'm just going to see if I can share my screen and then we'll dive in. How's that looking? Awesome. All right, so as I mentioned, today we're going to be going over the Bee City Communities Handbook. So really the idea behind this was just that we wanted, as an organization that's focused on communities protecting pollinators, we wanted to provide a fairly comprehensive action framework to inspire communities to engage in further action and also to promote the action that communities are taking, because pretty well all of the actions that we've got in here are things that communities are taking, and we've got examples. So we want to celebrate that, but also for new communities, provide that inspiration of what can be done. And we've divided this resource into 3 main categories. And these 3 categories reflect the 3 core commitments that Bee City communities make when they join the Bee City program. So those 3 categories are habitat creation and management, providing food and shelter for pollinators, education and engagement, and celebrating pollinators, which primarily is done during Pollinator Week. This week, happy Pollinator Week to everybody, but also during other times, such as World Bee Day. So I'm going to be going through the habitat creation and management section, and then Adèle is going to be going through education and engagement and celebration. And with the habitat section, we've divided it into 3 different categories. So the first one is habitat planning and creation, actually getting that habitat in the ground. The second is habitat management practices, making sure we know where we should add habitat, the value of that habitat, and making sure that the habitat is maintained over time. And then third, we've got empowering and incentivizing residents to create habitat. And this one is a really important one for me as the Bee City Canada coordinator. I'm seeing a lot of really exciting actions here. Often communities have really bold plans to support pollinators, and the more communities can engage residents to help with these goals, the more likely you'll be to achieve them. So I'll start by diving into the habitat planning and creation section. So we've got 6 actions here. The first one, and probably the most obvious action that we all think about when we're thinking about supporting pollinators, is create native plant pollinator gardens. So these are more contained typically. These obviously we want to prioritize plants that are native to the region, it's in the name. But the reason for this is that these plants have co-evolved with all of the native pollinators that we are trying to protect. So they provide them what they need in terms of food and nesting resources. These plants are also adapted to the regions that we're in. They've evolved there, so they tend to be easier to grow, which is fantastic. They don't require additional inputs, such as water. So some principles for these native plant pollinator gardens: we want to incorporate a range of plants that provide food for pollinators from spring to fall. Really important that we're providing food to pollinators all year long. Spring is often a difficult time for some pollinators as they're emerging from overwintering. So having those food sources right there when they're getting established is critical. Also moving into the fall when they're getting ready to overwinter, it's really important that they have those food sources available. Asters and goldenrod tend to be really great options. We want to make sure we're including pollinator host plants. These are the really specialized relationships we want to be supporting. So probably the one everybody's familiar with is the monarch and milkweed. The monarch depends on milkweed to lay its eggs on, because then the caterpillars emerge and they eat the milkweed, and that's how the life cycle goes on. There's lots of specialist bees that require pollen as the protein source from very particular plant groups. But the beauty of these host plants is they support all of these species in the really particular ways, but they also support lots of other pollinators by providing food. So host plants are awesome. Also, we want to leave bare patches of soil, stems, dead stalks as nesting space. 70% or so of bees actually, of bee species actually nest underground, which often surprises a lot of people. And then the remainder of those species, the majority nest in cavities. So things like stems of plants and holes in dead wood. So having nesting space is really important, and having food near that nesting space, and then avoiding insecticides. There's really not a need to have insecticides in a native plant garden. So a couple of examples here on the left, and we've got examples for pretty well every action. One is the Mono Pollinator Garden. This is a beautiful pollinator garden in Mono, Ontario, with support from the municipality. And then we've got the Fairview Cemetery planting in Niagara Falls. This was a community event to plant habitat in a cemetery, which I think can be a really good spot to create habitat because there's often lots of grass that can be a good spot for habitat, but also it beautifies the area for people that are visiting. The next action is create edible gardens, orchards, and food forests. So this one is really a win-win for pollinators and people. Of course, provides pollinators with loads of pollen, which is their protein source, and nectar, which is their carbohydrates, and also provides people with lots of fresh produce. So we're thinking about fruit trees, shrubs that are producing berries. Lots of different plants can be incorporated. One example here from Grand Prairie, Alberta, they've got an edible landscaping policy. So a goal through this is to incorporate more and more fruit trees into the municipality year after year. And these fruit trees are actually available to the public to just visit and gather food from. So also helps with food security, which is awesome. This is a really important concept, the idea of creating habitat networks. So not only does creating these networks provide food sources and nesting sites for pollinators, but it connects pollinators and helps them to move through the environment, which is particularly important when we're thinking about a lot of the smaller species, especially the really small bees that have a really short foraging range. When we're thinking about honeybees or bumblebees, they can fly several kilometers to go get food from the nest, but some species are flying a matter of meters, sometimes less than 100 meters to collect food. So making sure there's lots of habitat kind of spaced throughout the community that allows pollinators to move within and make sure that there's going to be food close to any nesting site is really critical. A couple examples, we got Project Swallowtail. This is a great community initiative in Toronto. It started in the High Park neighborhood and has since expanded a bit. But the idea here is really to connect to neighbors and in that help pollinators. So there's block ambassadors that are a part of this program. So that's kind of the go-to people for different areas in the neighborhood. If you have questions about how to support pollinators, there's also seed sitters that are part of this program that will collect seed and grow out plants to help neighbors. And then we've also got the Richmond Nectar Trail in Richmond, BC. This is a municipal initiative to get people to create habitat included on the map to enhance creating just a habitat network throughout the municipality. Naturalize large habitat areas. So naturalization means bringing native plants back into landscapes, giving them the space and support that they need to reestablish and thrive. So really important to have connected habitat, but it's also important to have larger areas of habitat that can really be an oasis for pollinators. And having these large areas can help to restore landscape functions broadly, can help boost biodiversity. Once established, it can help to minimize maintenance costs with reduced mowing, also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And these areas in particular can provide residents with much needed access to nature and its restorative benefits. There's some really cool research out there showing that the more biodiversity there is in a park, the more psychological restoration people actually claim to experience having visited one. So these larger areas, if they're really biodiverse, can really provide that benefit for people. So for these projects, you can think of parks, roadsides, shores, utility lands. These are some examples where they often take place, but of course, anywhere where you've got the space to do it is good to consider. So a couple examples here. We've got in Toronto, the Meadowway project, which to my knowledge is the largest hydro corridor project devoted to pollinators. It's really cool. It's also connected through bike trails, so you can go for a really awesome bike ride through here. And then in Guelph, there's the Silver Creek Hydro Corridor, which is a really great one too. Here's an action that I've been really excited about lately, and I'm hoping this kind of builds up steam. Dedicate resources to native plant propagation. Oftentimes, municipalities devote a lot of greenhouse space to propagating non-native, solely ornamental plants. These are for flower beds, for hanging baskets. often because people view them as beautiful. But if we take some of the space and devote this space to growing native plants, a lot of these plants can also be beautiful, and they can provide really important benefits to our ecosystems. So a really good example of this is Guelph has the herbaceous plants propagation program. I believe it's been going for 4 or 5 years now, and they're growing, I believe, over 50 different species of native plants in their greenhouse each year. I actually visited the greenhouse a few months ago and got to see some of the plants growing, which was awesome. But they've got a really great loop going where they collect seeds from plants throughout the municipality, bring them into the greenhouse, grow them out, and then the next year they're able to use these in municipal plantings and also able to give some of these seeds away to residents. They do a lot of seed giveaways as well. And then in Whitby, there's a similar program happening called the Seeds for Bees program, where they're propagating plants in the greenhouse, integrating them into municipal plantings. So this is really exciting. It's a great way to also, over time, bring down the cost of these planting efforts. So this is something I really hope to see a lot more communities engaging in. And then a final one for this section, develop habitat tools and guides to streamline projects. If a lot of these projects are happening in your municipality, it can be really helpful to have these guides just to make sure staff know exactly what's going on. It really streamlines the process. I like to point to Calgary's resources here because they've got this habitat restoration project framework, which is fantastic. It goes through all the steps. And they've got a lot of supplemental guides to this, such as seed mix lists, soil handling recommendations, and other things. So that was kind of the direct habitat creation side of things, but it's also really important to think about habitat management practices. And the first one I've got here is using integrated vegetation management. It's beyond the scope of this webinar to get really deep into integrated vegetation management. But the idea here is really making sure that there's a plan in place to ensure that the habitat that's been created is going to thrive. And that especially if chemical means are being used in this process, making sure they're kept to a minimum and only used when needed. Ideally focusing on targeted approaches, whether that's mechanical or chemical, over kind of broad scale use, such as broad scale herbicide use. Reducing mowing frequency can also be a win-win. Often this can result in reduced maintenance costs, of course, reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Important to note that there's definitely a place for mowing and restoration, especially in kind of the early stages, to make sure some of those weedy plants are being controlled. But over time, being able to reduce mowing can be really beneficial. One example here, this is from Brampton, Ontario, Don't Mow, Let It Grow. Through this program, they've identified lots of sites to just kind of let grow. And in many of these sites, they're doing active pollinator plantings. So one really great example here is the Dearborn Park Pollinator Habitat Project. This was a no-mow area that the community got really interested in. So now there's actually just local community members that are engaged. They were there for a community planting, and they're there for the maintenance of the habitat as well, and it's going to become a site for education. In a similar vein, it's important to restrict chemical applications that can harm pollinators. Insecticides can be lethal in some cases, particularly when they're used incorrectly. Most often what we're dealing with insecticides is sublethal impacts on pollinators. This is what I did my master's on. There can be a range of sublethal impacts. It can impact their ability to learn about food sources, to navigate their environment, get to food and back home. So there's a range of impacts that these things can have. So what we recommend is having an integrated pest management plan, which is essentially just a plan that's in place that minimizes the use of chemicals, so that they're really only used as a last resort in certain cases. Also really important in some cases to have a ban on just cosmetic use of pesticides, especially in the cosmetic cases. Agriculture is a different thing, but when we're looking at cosmetics, this is not super important. So we want to make sure we're not using pesticides for that reason. Ontario has good restrictions on this. Halifax does. I know lots of communities do. One example for IPM I wanted to bring up is Calgary. They've got a great IPM plan, and they actually publish which chemicals are used, so you can actually check that information, see if things are going down over time. So making it publicly available is a great idea. Really important to set habitat standards and recommendations for urban development. The idea here is that when areas are being developed, we want to be making sure we're bringing pollinators with us. So making sure that if development's happening, there are certain standards that must be upheld when we're thinking about pollinators. So this can include having a minimum proportion of native plants that are integrated into these sites, making sure there's nesting sites, encouraging green roofs that native plants can be integrated into, and then of course restrictions on things that can have a negative impact, such as invasive species and chemical use. So one good example of this is in Toronto, the Toronto Green Standard. They've got a minimum proportion of native plants that have to be integrated. They've got incentives for green roofs, and they also have restrictions on invasive species, which is all great. And then I also wanted to point out Collingwood recently, they have a new downtown garden master plan that came out. And in that, there's lots of information about native plants, their benefits, plant lists, and there's an intention to increase the native plants in the downtown area as it grows. Another important one that's probably an obvious one for a lot of people, promote pollinator-friendly practices in community gardens. Community gardens are obviously a great place for this because people are growing food. We want to be attracting pollinators to these areas to pollinate the food that we're growing. So you can do this by obviously a lot of the food plants actually produce nectar and pollen that attract pollinators, but also integrating native plants into these sites so there's food all the time. Minimizing chemical inputs, leaving leaves, stems, and dead stalks as nesting space. Particularly important to leave them during the winter and into the early spring, so there's time for pollinators to overwinter in them and then emerge. There's an example on this slide that I love. It's from Tiny, Ontario. This is a Depave Paradise project, which is an awesome program. So you can see they're ripping up an old tennis court, and this was turned into a community garden. And then they've taken a lot of these steps to make the community garden pollinator friendly. This one's often a bit of a controversial one, restrict urban honey beekeeping. I think with this one, it's really important that we remember honeybees are not a native pollinator species to Canada. So because of this, they're not of conservation concern. They are essential for our agriculture. And the big thing here is that agriculture and urban beekeeping are two totally different stories, because especially in some of our urban areas, when they're really densely populated, think of the big cities, densely populated, not a ton of flowers around. Just the carrying capacity in terms of pollinators is relatively low. And if we have a lot of people bringing in honeybees to these areas, which their colonies can be very big, upwards of 10,000 bees, there can be competition for that limited food between the honeybees and the native bees in the area, particularly for the really small native bees we're learning that don't have a long foraging range. So when we're thinking about urban honey beekeeping, we want to consider restricting that. It's a different story for agriculture. With potentially some exceptions for crop pollination, honey production, hive product production. But it's also important to just be tracking how many honeybee colonies are in the area so you have a sense of whether there might be this competition going on. Also wanted to mention Vancouver's got a really good beekeeping myths webpage. So if you go on their webpage, you'll see there's a little section that discusses that urban beekeeping, if what you're trying to do is support native bee populations, this is not a solution to that. And then it points people in the direction of instead create habitat, which benefits both honeybees and all the native bees as well. Minimize impacts of artificial nighttime light. So this has been shown to reduce nocturnal pollinator abundance, to reduce pollinator visits to night blooming plants. And in one study, there was a direct effect on moth reproductive success. These are a few of the impacts to pollinators, but we know artificial nighttime light can affect much more than pollinators, especially with migratory birds. I know this is a particular concern. So in order to reduce these impacts, we recommend, of course, reducing overall quantity and intensity of artificial nighttime light, ideally through things like motion detectors, so that lights are only on when there's a reason for them to be on. And then in the cases where they are on, making sure we're favoring warm colored LED bulbs and fixtures that minimize glare. Delay yard waste collection. So as I mentioned before, pollinators often overwinter in gardens and parks and other areas. They often overwinter in the plant material that's left, the leaves, the stems. So by removing this plant material from managed areas kind of in the early spring, we actually do risk removing these overwintering pollinators with this material if we're putting them in a yard waste bag and having them sent off before they've emerged. So as a homeowner, consider not cleaning up your garden until temperatures are consistently above 10 degrees Celsius in your region for a week or two or so that there's time for pollinators to emerge from this plant material first. From the municipality perspective, you can formally push back waste collection. So I know Toronto introduced an amendment to do this a year or two ago. Unfortunately, it did not pass, but hopefully this at least serves as some inspiration for other communities to consider it. And hopefully Toronto will try it again in the future. I've heard some rumblings that it might be happening again. Complete a natural asset inventory. So natural assets, which I know often is kind of a weird word to use when we're thinking about pollinators, but it's important. These natural assets, including pollinators, forests, wetlands, rivers, many more things. They provide us with critical services, which we all know: pollination, stormwater management, climate mitigation, climate change mitigation, lots of things. So conducting this natural asset inventory is a way to take a look and see what is the kind of economic value of all of these things. Can be a really good way just to have a broader understanding and then to use this information as an argument for conservation for people that are taking this from more of that economic lens. So Okotoks in Alberta has a really good natural asset inventory, and they actually quantified the value of native pollinators in their area, which was really cool to see. And then create a pollinator habitat map. Mapping is awesome. Mapping allows you to understand where is habitat in our community and where is there not habitat. So where should we create habitat going forward? This helps with the idea of habitat connectivity, making sure there's habitat everywhere for pollinators to move through. This is a really good example in Hamilton, the Hamilton Pollinator Paradise Project, where they've mapped residential gardens, naturalized areas, school gardens, lots of gardens on this map, so you can see where there is and isn't habitat. And there's even an annual garden, native garden award that they give out called the Monarch Awards. So then on to the last section, empowering and incentivizing residents to create habitat. This one I particularly love. As I mentioned, communities often have really bold plans to support pollinators, and it's really important that we bring the community with us to make these things happen. And one really important one is making sure that our lawn bylaws empower people to create habitat, making sure they celebrate people creating habitat and don't restrict people from creating habitat, because it's important to bring people along to help them to help us create create habitat and support pollinators, but the last thing we want to do is be actively getting in the way of people's efforts to create pollinator habitat when done safely. So a lot of the time, these bylaws are fairly old. They use fairly vague language. So things such as unsightly and weed in cases where weed isn't defined. So often these words make it really difficult for people to understand what is and is not allowed in a home garden. And these bylaws are often driven by complaints from neighbors as well. So there have been lots of cases where there are complaints, and then the city bylaw responds and actually asks people to remove plants from their yard, even if these are native plants that are benefiting pollinators, and even if it's not really clear how it went against the bylaw, because something like unsightly and weed is kind of a vague term. So I like to point to Toronto's bylaw, which they've modified a couple of years ago. I think it looks really good. So what they do is they restrict specifically turf grass in terms of height. So they define what turf grass is. They have a height restriction for that. The idea being that people that are just growing tall turf grass and not native plants, it's not necessarily super beneficial to pollinators. And then they've also got a restriction for cases where there are plants that are blocking an important driver or pedestrian sightline, which is a safety thing. And then most importantly, they've got a prohibited plant list that's local to the area. So this list is really focused on avoiding harm to people and to native plant communities. It's noxious plants that can harm people, invasive plants that can harm native plant communities. So there's this list that bylaw officers can look at, see, is there one of these plants in someone's yard? It should be removed. So making that bylaw really clear, people can see that and say, okay, I know what I can and can't do in my yard. And then, of course, the next step is once it's in writing, you got to train bylaw officers to make sure they're able to enforce that bylaw correctly if it's been updated. So that's an important consideration as well. And just wanted to point out this picture from Douglas Counter, who lives in Etobicoke. He shared this picture with me. This is his front yard. It's a beautiful front yard and boulevard with lots of native plants on it. And this is exactly what we want residents to be doing. It's awesome. In a similar vein, enable and encourage residents to plant on boulevards. These are the areas between the road and the sidewalk. Often they're just turf and people have to mow them, but they're really a great spot for native plants. And a group that's doing really good work when it comes to boulevards is Blooming Boulevards. This is a group in Mississauga. They have awesome resources on their website that give you a plant list of what are plants that are going to work in this area. So they tend to be plants that are less tall because you don't want important driver or pedestrian sightlines to be blocked in this area for safety. They also give plants that are more salt tolerant because often salt is used on roads in municipalities. So lots of considerations given to which plants are most successful. And they also create tons of boulevard gardens in Mississauga. I think they've created over 300 gardens in the last 4 years or so. So they're doing incredible work. Provide pollinator habitat grants and rebates. This one's really important. By providing funding, you're going to be breaking down one of the most significant barriers that residents face when it comes to creating habitat. It can often be expensive to do so. And you can do this in a number of ways. An example of providing a rebate is Collingwood has the Bees and Trees program, which provides a rebate. They provide a rebate of up to $150. So they provide 50% money back up to $300 that you spend. So they would provide you $150 back, which can go a long way if you're creating native plant habitat. And then on the other side with grants, you can look at Toronto's Pollinate TO grant program, where community groups can apply to receive funding for a particular project in their community to support pollinators. Offer native plant giveaways and subsidized sales. So these are another great way to bring down the cost, but Also, really importantly, it's a way to get plants into people's hands because often it can be a far drive to get to a native plant nursery. It can be hard to know which plants you should get. Through these, an example here, we've got Richmond Hill's Healthy Yards program. They do one of these sales every year. They've got different kits. They've got a sun kit, they've got a shade kit. These are all great native plants, so it's local. People can take public transit to pick these up. And they know they're going to get plants that are going to work for their particular area. Provide pollinator-friendly garden consultations. So this is a really great one. I don't see this happening a ton, but it's really exciting because another one of the barriers that people face is, okay, I know I want to create habitat, I have the funds to do it, but how do I actually do this? Knowing information about their site, the soil there, what are the levels of sun, what plants are going to work here. If you can actually provide support in this way, that can go a long way. Really good example of this is Guelph's Healthy Landscapes Visits program. So someone from this program will actually come to your home, take a look at your yard and give recommendations, answer any questions you have. So this is a really good way to help people out. Also promoting pollinator-friendly garden certification programs. There's lots of these programs throughout Canada. One that Pollinator Partnership has is the Bee Friendly Garden program. This is a really good program. We've got a monthly newsletter for people that gives lots of info about plants and people's stories with native plant gardening. There's an option to get your garden put on a map, to get signage, to educate your community about your native plant garden, and lots of other resources to help with gardening. So promoting these programs can be really great to get residents involved. Also initiating seed libraries and encouraging seed exchange. This can be a really great tool to encourage distribution of native plant seeds within the community. It can also bring down cost if people are willing to share. Often we see native seed libraries at local libraries, which is really cool. Here you can see in Barrie, they've got in their community gardens little seed boxes that people can put seeds in for others to take home. And also wanted to point out Seeds of Diversity, which is a fantastic nonprofit that is behind the CD Saturday and Sunday events that happen all across Canada, which are really great events for people to share seed and share information. And then the last habitat-related topic I wanted to mention was support farmers to protect pollinators and agricultural lands. Often we're not thinking about agricultural lands when we're thinking about creating habitat in communities or kind of municipalities, but this is really important. Farmers often can really benefit from financial assistance to create things like hedgerows and flower strips to support pollinators. And then this can also help with pollination in the farm. So this is a really important one as well, not to forget. And that's it for habitat. And now I will turn it over to Adèle.
Yes, can you just stop sharing? Perfect.
Yep.
Thank you very much. And I'll share mine. Hopefully it works.
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. Okay. So in order to create, we talked about habitat creation. So in order to create and manage that habitat, you need inspired and dedicated people that are willing to take actions to protect pollinators. So we're going to talk about that, how you can engage your residents through media, education, and materials, and activities and events. So the first one is through media, education, and materials. We have 6 different actions. The first one is to promote pollinator conservation through media channels. So having a pollinator page on your website or on a community website is a great starting point, but you could have many other options. You have social media posts. Here we have the example of the account Bee City Brandon on Instagram that is actually posting about Pollinator Week right now and posts regularly about updates in the city. But you can also have through newsletters, articles, TV news, broadcasts, etc. And the goal is to tell residents about what you're doing in terms of pollinator initiatives, how they can get involved because they're usually looking for that, and what they can do to support pollinators at home and in their daily life. Another fun way to engage your residents is to provide education and awareness materials about the pollinators. Advance pollinator awareness and knowledge in your community by providing educational resources and pollinator theme material to your resident. The goal is maybe to share information about your local native bees. For example, in Toronto, they did this really good book called The Bees of Toronto, sharing what bees you can find in your neighborhoods and in the city. And the city of Peterborough in 2017 had this amazing Peterborough pollinator calendar that the resident could have access to. And yeah, you can provide information about native pollinators, but also best gardening practices and pollinator initiatives in general. Also, a fun way to do it is to use signage to educate about pollinators and also promote your membership in Bee City Canada, and more broadly to educate your communities about pollinator and creating quality habitat. The goal may be to have your signage in prominent locations and in area where there's high foot traffic. And these signs can drive community interest and engagement in what you're doing. So here we have two great examples in Mississauga and in Calgary as well, with their beautiful naturalization sign and that beautiful little bee. What you can also do is provide pollinator-related training to employees, because to engage and to educate your resident is good, but you can also educate your employee that can actually have an influence on land management decision and fund pollinator projects. This can include your parks and environment staff, the bylaw enforcement staff, landscapers, etc. And at P2C, so Pollinator Partnership Canada, we have this great program called the Pollinator Stewardship Certification Training. It's actually in two sections. So the first one, you have training modules that you have to follow for a couple of weeks or a couple of days to talk about pollinators, to learn about them, how you can create habitat. You also have a different perspective, which is very interesting. And then you have to create one habitat action and one outreach and engagement action. So you learn about pollinator and actually you work to help them. A really important part is also to educate youth about pollinators through schools and camps. Children are our future, and it's important for them that they understand the importance of pollinators and that they think about them in their daily life and when they're going to make decisions. So consider providing content and resources to schools and camps in your community to help children understand how pollinators are important. You can also encourage field trips to pollinator gardens, and if you have naturalized area, you may even consider putting a program in place to provide funds and support for teachers to create pollinator gardens with students at local school. We have bee cities in Bee City, Canada, but we also have bee schools, and we created many resources for them to have access to, and we actually created one for Pollinator Week. You can find it on our website in the Kids Corner section, and you will have a lot of booklets that you could share with your local schools. Also, you can use bee hotels to educate about native bees. So we hear a lot about bee hotels as well. So if your goal is to provide bees with nesting place, the best thing you can do is leaving bare patches of soil, planting plants, native plants that provide natural nesting sites through hollow stems, etc. But however, if your goal is to educate people about the lives of native bees, bee hotels can be an excellent tool. Children can look at it, see how like leafcutter bees made their nest, or etc. And here we have a good example in Victoria, in British Columbia, with this pop-up native bee apiary made with border-free bees. And they can actually be very beautiful. So here also you can engage your population, your resident, through activities and events. We have 8 actions. The first one being to feature pollinator talks and workshops It's a great way to engage residents of all ages across your community. There is no shortage of topics. You can talk about pollinator diversity, gardening for pollinators and food security, etc., etc. We did other webinars, including one with the City of Montreal, and we talked about what the city and the district of Saint-Laurent is actually doing for the pollinators. And we also had a section about the program Mission Monarch, and we're going to talk about it later. And we also have the example of the Pollination Guelph's annual symposium that was actually not a long time ago, where they discussed what the city and the group, the local groups are doing for pollinator conservation. You can also organize pollinator exhibits and day events. So it's a great way to teach kids about pollinators in an interactive settings, while also providing pollinator facts that might interest the adults as well. Considering setting up team stations, pollinator identification activities, etc. Another approach is to feature pollinators at broader insect events, such as the Entomological Society of Ontario's Bug Day, which is happening in Guelph, where the children can learn about insects in general, and they can learn also about pollinators. And we have in the Waterloo region the Amazing Pollinators exhibit, where children can learn about pollinators in a really fun way. You can also bring the community together for habitat creation and maintenance events. So here we have two different examples of two different generations, but they seem to equally have fun. So it's one of the best ways to educate and engage residents whilst also creating habitat, is to provide land stewardship opportunities. You can have planting events. In Colorado Lake, they did this biking for pollinator events where they created these seed balls that they were throwing from their bike. And then in King Township, you have these children having this planting experience. It's just to allow them to like learn about pollinators while having fun and creating habitat for them. Another action is to invite the community to pollinator habitat tour. It's a great way to educate residents about what you're doing about pollinators and to actually take them to look at the plants, understand the significance of creating habitat. And so there's no such thing as a small pollinator habitat. You can show a large variety of habitats in large naturalized area, or just in a native plant strip alongside a street in your community. And people can actually see about the diversity of pollinators in their city, in their community, etc. So the city of Cambridge, Ontario did this virtual habitat tour, and yeah, you can find ways to do that. You can also encourage participation in community science. It's a really fun way and a really nice opportunity for residents to learn again about pollinators, because it's always the goal, and other plants and animals in their area, while also helping scientists to monitor ecologies broadly in a way that will not be possible without the help of the residents. So as I mentioned before, there's this really good program in Montreal. It's called Mission Monarch, where people with their phone can actually monitor where they see monarch as an adult, but also as an egg in the city and more broadly in Canada. And also there's the city of Brandon that participated in the City Nature Challenge. That is actually a global event where you can monitor nature in your city. Another fun way is to partner with food festivals, restaurants, and bars to promote pollinators, so that people can actually understand the link between food production and pollinators, since most of the crops grown for human consumption depend on pollinator. So it's really a fun way. You partner with food festivals, with restaurants to showcase what the pollinators are doing, just like in this incredible edibles festival in Campbellford, Ford in Ontario. So it's just a fun way to have good food and also be thankful for what the pollinators are doing. And then you can feature pollinators at broader community events. So while pollinator-focused events can be really nice, it can also be good to like have a talk about like pollinators or Bee City Canada in a bigger event like in Timmins, Ontario, where they talk about how they joined recently the program in the event that is called Welcome to Timmins Night. And yeah, it's just you can set up a Bee City Canada booth during like think about Earth Day or World Bee Day, etc. You can talk about pollinators and Bee City Canada. And then you can also see community feedback through public consultation and survey. If you're, for example, like the city of Collingwood that released recently their pollinator protection plan, they ask for the feedback of their community through a survey and a public consultation. It's a great way to hear their feedback and maybe have new ideas that you didn't thought about before. And yeah, it's another approach to help pollinators while engaging your community at the same time. So finally, the third big section is Pollinator Week celebration. So as Jordan mentioned, we're actually in the middle of Pollinator Week. So happy Pollinator Week, everyone. So we're going to talk about first how to promote Pollinator Week prior to the event, and then actions to celebrate during Pollinator Week. So what you can do to promote? Well, you can issue a Pollinator Week proclamation or a press release prior to the event to talk about what is going to happen, maybe the fact that you're already a BCD and it's important for you to participate. You can put up banners and signs and display around the community. And you can launch a social media campaign. I can see on social media that a lot of BCDs are actually posting about it. And it's very important for your community to learn about it and to see what you're actually doing. Here we have a photo of the CN Tower in Toronto being illuminated last year in honor of Pollinator Week. And in Canada this year, we actually have 19 monuments, including Niagara Falls, the Parliament buildings in Victoria, BC, that are also going to be illuminated in yellow to celebrate Pollinator Week. And then what can you do to celebrate during Pollinator Week? So there are many ways you can do that. First, you can host a pollinator festival in an area with plenty of pollinator habitat, for example, for residents to explore, see what you did, and then maybe for you to engage with them. You can provide opportunities for education. As I mentioned, we have resources for kids, booklets, for example, with coloring pages, where next to a pollinator habitat, they can actually learn about pollinators while seeing them. You can recognize community efforts through pollinator garden contests. You can organize a garden contest focused on pollinator, or you can have a broader contest and have a pollinator category. It's a great way to recognize residents that are creating pollinator habitat on their own property. And you can even give the winner a sign or a prize or a gift card to a local plant nursery. Here we have two examples, Be a Hero in Kawartha Lake, and then the Monarch Awards in Hamilton. Another fun way to celebrate Pollinator Week is that if you created a new habitat for pollinators, you can do an opening ceremony. You can share fun facts about how you created that habitat, fun facts about pollinator, and it's a great opportunity to, again, educate your community about pollinators, about the plants, and to celebrate habitat accomplishments. One of my favorite things to do is to create pollinator-themed public arts. It's a really fun way to engage and to attract the attention of your community. In Toronto, we have this beautiful mural from Nick Switzman that is downtown with this the official bee of Toronto. And then in King Township, they did this beautiful Flutterby the butterfly that is made of 250 puzzle pieces that were made by local residents to raise awareness about pollinators and the amazing things that they are doing for us. You can also launch a pollinator photo contest on social media. It's a fun way to engage your community, for them to go outside, to look at pollinators, to look at plants. And then you can, after that, post it on social media, or even like we had the city of Barrie that this pick a pollinator contest. And the photo of the winner was on their Pollinator Week page on their website. And you can make your resident participate in that, and yeah, again, go outside. Also, one of the last things that you can do is to present a pollinator theme screening. It's a great way to engage, again, a lot of residents of all ages. You can host that in a community building, such as a local library, for example. And you can also, after that, invite local experts to do a Q&A to talk about the film, the documentary, etc. Here we have Pollinators Under Pressure, that is narrated by Leonardo DiCaprio, so pretty nice. And it's actually free. You can find it online. And we have Wings of Life that is available on Disney Nature, and that was narrated by Meryl Streep, so also a pretty good choice. And then final thing is you can provide pollinator theme giveaways. It's a great way to, like, again, engage the community. I feel like I'm repeating that all the time, but it's really the goal. You can give out native plants, seeds, pollinator garden signage, or even like unique items, tablecloth, gardening cloths, or a BCT. And you can also put the BCT Canada logo and your logo as well to really raise awareness. And once you capture the attention of your residents, what you can do is you can announce future projects at the end of the week, and you can look out for volunteers, try to recruit them. And it's really the best time to have residents join the BCT Canada movement and commit to future action. And yeah, you already gotten their attention, so it's the perfect time. And here is again, Jordan will talk about the 5-year plan, but thank you for your attention.
Thanks for passing it off. In the interest of time, I'm gonna kind of go quickly through the 5-year plan, kind of like the high level, not get into the nitty gritty of it. But you can download this on the Bee City website and read through yourself all the actions in this 5-year plan. But the main point I wanted to make with the 5-year plan is we know that most communities are coming into the program with a lot of initiatives in the works, not starting kind of from zero. So looking at this as a way to compare what are we doing and are there any additional things we could be adding and where do we want to go is the idea. So we've got from year 1 to year 5, kind of planting seeds to continued flourishing, we call it, with more plants and pollinators in the illustration as you go. Some ideas for year 1, get that pollinator habitat map of the area so you know what you're working with and where you want to go. Maybe consider creating a pollinator demonstration garden to show people this is what it looks like, this is how you make one. Review policies and practices related to pollinators, so that yard bylaw, any integrated vegetation or pest management plans, things like that. From an education engagement perspective, consider creating a pollinator page on the community website that has some information and then also info about initiatives that are ongoing. For Pollinator Week, you might consider a Pollinator Week proclamation, which I know many communities do, putting up signs and banners. And then I'll let people read in between year 1 and 5 in the actual document, but zoom into year 5, some things you might want to look at are growing out plants in greenhouses, growing native plants, getting that cycle going of collecting seed, growing plants, giving it to residents, getting plants in the ground in the community and increasing native plants that way. Education, you might consider creating some local resources about plants and pollinators. And then for Pollinator Week, you might consider a festival. Well, lots of fun stuff. And again, This is all available on our website. You can read through all the actions, read through the 5-year plan. And I do see it's already 2:02. I don't think we've got any questions in the Q&A, which may be for the best, given the time, as we should probably end it. But if anybody does have any questions about this, please feel free to email myself or Adèle. Our emails are there, just our names at pollinator.org. Yeah, so with that, we'll end the webinar. Really appreciate everybody joining. I hope everybody learned some stuff and that it was useful. And hopefully if you saw some examples that if it was from your municipality, it was nice to see in there. We really appreciate all the work all these communities are doing that allows us to create a resource like this. So thank you so much. Hope everybody has a great rest of your pollinator week. Hope you tune into future Bee City webinars, and we'll see you next time.